very left-wing or very right-wing, some of the media may say, you know, this doesn't represent a genuine change of heart of the party leaders. This is a cynical ploy to pander for votes. So the media coverage will surely change. If a party shifts its positions, some of the special interest groups or voting blocs that used to donate money to the party will stop donating money, and some new special interest groups and voting blocs will likely start donating money. If you shift your positions radically, then many of your longtime activists, the people who do the crucial but unnoticed roles like stuffing envelopes, putting up campaign posters, driving voters to the polls, in today's world sending out internet messages, will feel betrayed and they'll stop providing those crucial resources, but perhaps other new activists will join the party. So in fact, if you really shift your position, if you're a party leader, to any significant extent, it's not true that you can shift it and nothing else will change. In fact, everything else will change. And my first generation of research I just described didn't take that into account. Now, one other quick comment about that for the graduate students. What I've just said seems to be really condemning my own previous research. What I want to point out is what I did then and what I try to do now is I try to see all the limitations of what I'm doing, but it's possible to see the limitations of what you're doing and still feel proud about what you're doing. You know, I thought what I was doing was moving the ball forward and was better than what the previous spatial modelers had done. I didn't necessarily think it was good, but I thought it was better. And one point or trap I tended to fall into as a graduate student was any project I was working on, I thought the goal of the project was to provide the one final, complete answer to the question I was looking at. What I realize now is that's just not feasible. Almost every step of my research isn't in providing a final answer. It's, I hope, just moving the ball forward a little bit and improving, sometimes marginally, on what came before, with the hope that at some point when Jim Adams is no longer around, other people will look at this research and the parts they like, they'll try to build on that, and eventually, who knows, 100, 200 years from now, we'll actually get the answers. But the fact we can't get the final answer now doesn't mean we can't do what we can to improve on our research. Anyhow, the next stage of my project was different from these counterfactual simulations in the following sense. Before, I was looking at survey data and asking the question, how would have things changed if this party had done something differently? The new set of research that I'll describe now was different in that what I and my co-authors did was, instead of saying, let's do counterfactual simulations, in this new set of research, we actually looked at many hundreds of historical instances when parties did shift their positions, and we asked what actually happened. And of course, the value there is that in historical instances when parties shift their positions, everything else does change, and we were hoping we could take that into account and at least see what the ultimate impact was on parties' vote shares. Now, this new set of research was made possible by a data set that I assume most of you are familiar with, the Comparative Manifesto Project codings. Are you folks there in Amsterdam all familiar with this? Okay, terrific. So this data set was first made available in 2001. And what my co-author, this is Zeynep Somertoglu, is this particular co-author, who was a graduate student of mine. What we decided to do for a project that has sort of motivated me for the last couple of years was the following. We took these codings, and we could use these codings to have at least, we hoped, reasonably accurate measures of what a party's left-right position was, and note that the CMP data is available for every party in every post-war election in more than 24 countries. And so we could code, for example, the extent to which the British Labour Party shifted its position between the 1992 election under Neil Kinnock and the 1997 election for New Labour under Tony Blair. And in this paper here called Promise Now, Win Votes Later, what we performed, my co-author Zeynep Somertoglu and I, were pooled time series analyses of parties' left-right shifts calibrated against shifts and changes in their vote shares. And in this particular paper, the approach we used was the following. We were interested in answering a question or evaluating a hypothesis that most spatial modelers believe in, which is that when parties moderate their positions, shift towards the center, their vote shares tend to go up. And as I'm sure you can all guess, The primary logic behind that is that all of the voter surveys that we look at show a huge clump of voters in the center. And the logic is that if you move towards those voters, you'll pick up a lot more voters in the center than you will lose on the wings. But so far as I know, no one has ever really systematically tested this hypothesis with real-world data. So that's what Zeynep and I tried to do. We had codes of over 1,000 party shifts, and we coded each shift according to whether it seemed to bring the party closer to or farther away from the center of where the voters were located. And we used a very simple rule here. For every long-term left-wing party like Labor parties, Social Democratic parties, Communist parties, and so on, anytime they shifted towards the right, according to the CMP data, we inferred that that was moderating their position. If they shifted to the left, we inferred that as radicalizing their position, and vice versa for conservative and Christian Democratic parties. So what we simply looked at was, is there, if you look at all of these party shifts in, I think we looked at 25 different countries, and we looked at for every long-term party, we looked at every shift they made in every single post-war election. So we had over 1,000 shifts. Do you tend to see that when parties shifted towards the center, did their vote shares tend to go up? When they shifted away from the center, did their vote shares tend to go down? And what we found was a result which at the time I was surprised, I found both surprising and also, to me, quite displeasing. And that was the following: that when parties shifted towards the center of the voter distribution, their vote shares on average basically didn't change. And when they shifted farther away from the center of the voter distribution, again, on average, their vote shares didn't change. Now, it's not that we found absolutely nothing. As you might guess from this title, Promise Now, Win Votes Later, we found if you just squinted at the data and looked at it just right, what you would see is that if parties shifted dramatically towards the center, say 20 to 30 points on the CMP scale, which goes from negative 100 to positive 100, where 20 or 30 points, that's a big shift in this data. Then on average, the party wouldn't pick up any votes in the election when it shifted, but it would pick up on average about 0.5% of a vote at the subsequent election. That is, there was a lagged effect, which we attributed to the fact that it took a while for voters to A, recognize the party had actually shifted, and perhaps B, to really believe they meant it when they shifted to their new position. But while we played up that finding in the paper, to me the really surprising finding was that there seemed to be such a small effect when parties shifted. And as someone who tends to like spatial modeling, even if I don't like the spatial modelers who don't like my own work, I had always assumed that, when parties shift, it's going to have at least some effect. I didn't think there would be an enormous effect, right, based on my previous research. But if you'd asked me to guess ahead of time, I would have guessed that if, say, a big mainstream left-wing party shifted dramatically towards the center, or a big mainstream right-wing party shifted towards the center as well, if you'd asked me to predict ahead of time what we would have found, I would have said, I bet they'll pick up 2 or 3 or 4% of the vote on average. It just seemed logical. But we didn't find this. And that leads, of course, to the question, why didn't we find it? And I'll talk a little bit about that, and also about how the reviewers reacted to this particular research. As to why we didn't find what we expected to find. Well, of course, there are a lot of possible explanations. One is that voters didn't even notice that the parties had shifted their positions. And we know a lot of voters don't pay attention. Or maybe voters noticed that the parties were saying new things that they hadn't said before, but voters didn't believe it. They viewed this as some sort of a cynical election ploy in order to get votes. Or maybe, as some of my previous research suggested, voters may have noticed, but they just didn't care. They cared about the state of the economy and about leaders' personal qualities and so forth. Was there a question?
Yeah, just a curiosity. Were there country differences?
There were, but they weren't really systematic. One that I'll tell you about now, and because this will get to my next stage of my research. In Britain, for example, there really were some effects. And Tony Blair, voters noticed that New Labour had become more moderate, and based on our estimates, this really did help New Labour win some extra votes. So in Britain, there were some effects. In the Netherlands, we saw some effects. But in most countries, we didn't. And I don't have any strong, I can't give you any good explanation for why we found what we did in the Netherlands and Britain, except maybe it's just a fluke in the data. So I don't have a good answer about this. What I can tell you was that we tried to break out certain kinds of countries. Maybe in Western Europe, you'll get one reaction, but a different reaction in North America and so on. We didn't seem to find any system, or maybe you'll find big effects in two-party systems like the United States or a 2.5-party system like Britain, but not in the multi-party systems or vice versa. We didn't find any systematic effects like that. So I wish we had. Then we would have had a nice story that you don't get an effect except here's where you do. But we didn't find anything like that. So let me say a couple of things about people's and reviewers' reactions to this project and the reactions that we got at conference and so on. One kind of interesting reaction from my graduate student here, Zeynep Somer-Topku, and one that I get from many of the graduate students I've worked with, and I work with a lot of graduate students, is we got this result, and I said to Zeynep, okay, let's write this up and send it to the Journal of Politics. And she looked at me kind of funny. And she was a graduate student, but I could see in her eyes, the doubt in her eyes, and I knew what she was thinking, is this really good enough for the Journal of Politics? This doesn't seem like very good research to me. But of course, she was too polite to say it. One of the things, this is sort of an ongoing, something that happens a lot when I work with graduate students. Pretty much as soon as we finish a paper, even if we don't think it's totally polished, I always say, let's send it off. And let's send it off somewhere good. And the graduate student's reaction is always, no, it's not ready yet, it's not polished. The reviewers are going to be mean to us if we send it out now. And my reaction now is if there are problems with the paper, let's let the reviewers tell us that there are problems. Let's not sit on it for 6 months or a year, endlessly polishing it and worrying about every possible objection that reviewers might have. Well, in this case, for one of the rare times in my life, I think, my instinct was good. Because the reviewers' comments were by and large positive, with one exception I'll talk about in just a second. And you know what the reviewers said? They basically said, this is interesting. I don't really know if the authors are right. Maybe all this shows is that there's a problem with the Comparative Manifesto Project data. Or maybe they're leaving something else out. But even though we're not at all convinced the authors are right, if they are, it's pretty important. And the reaction of the reviewers was, you know what? I don't know if I buy this, but let's get it out there where it's published. Let's let other people read it, comment on it, criticize it, try to replicate it or whatever. And my own sense about why this research and some other research I'll talk about later got through is that, it's up to other people to say if my research is good or bad. But I think in the case of this research, we were in the dead center of the discussion, in the sense that we were looking at things that are really important for political representation. Because if voters don't react when parties shift their positions, as I say, I don't know if catastrophic is too strong a word, but that's really scary. And it's also obviously terrifically crucial for understanding parties' policy strategies. Because if Zeynep and I are right here, what that means is that it's a perfectly rational strategy to behave like a Margaret Thatcher or a Ronald Reagan, or like some of these Tea Party candidates now in the United States, who many of us sophisticated people say, they're too extreme. They can't possibly win. If we're right about this, then people need to rethink that particular argument. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have a question about this idea of party strategy. Do you know whether moderating increased the odds of becoming part of a coalition of
Yeah.
parties?
Okay, that's a really, really good point. And I take it what you have in mind is that even if changing your position and moderating your position has very little effect on your vote share, it might make you a much more attractive coalition partner. This is a terrible answer. I think we looked at it, but I don't remember what we found. I think we found that it didn't make much difference, but I found that result too surprising to publish. This finding that the party's vote shares didn't go up, I don't know if I believed it, but I thought there was a chance it was right, and so I thought, let's get it out there, let's publish it, and if we're wrong, let's have someone else tell us we're wrong. the finding that a party wouldn't become a more attractive coalition partner when it's more moderate, as I recall, that's what we found, but I just didn't believe it. It didn't seem to make sense. You know, my sort of rule on publishing these things is, if I think there's a pretty good chance I'm right, I'll publish it. I won't publish things even if there are statistically significant relationships if I just don't believe it, because I don't want to be embarrassed later on. But in answer to your question, I don't remember exactly what we found. Your basic thought there, that parties' positions may have a huge effect on whether they get into the government, regardless of whether they have an effect on their vote share. I'm sure you're right about that. But we decided not to systematically look in that direction. It's a good thing to look at. Maybe you should do that. You might think about it anyway. So we published that research, and let me just tell you again briefly. So do I believe it? Do I think it's good research? Do I think I've got the answer right? I don't know. If you'd asked me beforehand, I would have said I believe at a 90% level of certainty that moving to the center will probably have a somewhat significant impact on parties' vote shares and improve their fortune. Based on this research, I now don't know. Before I thought it was 90% sure. Now I think it's maybe 30 or 40% sure, even though I didn't find these patterns in my own research. And the reason why I still have this residual, and I should mention, I didn't not only not find these patterns, I didn't even find any evidence of anything like these patterns. As I said, our best estimate was that you could gain maybe 1/2% of the vote if you hugely moderated your positions. It was just a trivial effect. As to why, I'm still not sure that that's true. One of the things I worried about was problems with the data. We were working with the Comparative Manifesto project with the data. Now, I found in talking to people about this data, the world is divided into two camps. One camp absolutely believes that data is true, is absolutely accurate, and considers it blasphemy to even suggest that there might be minute measurement error in that data. And I talked to some of those people at Essex 2 or 3 days ago, and there are other people who really hate the data and think that these estimates of the party's left-right positions are no better than random guessing. You know, I don't have a strong opinion about this, but I had to consider the possibility that the reason we found no relationship is that our data on policy positioning really wasn't very good. And furthermore, even if the data was good, I still would need to know the answer to the question, well, if the data is good, why is it the case that when parties shift their positions, voters barely seem to react? And so that got to what I call sort of strand of research 2B here. And what we did here, well, let me introduce the argument in a second. What I said before, remember, is that when parties shift towards the center, their vote share hardly changes. But note that that is not equivalent to saying that when parties shift their position, voters don't react. An alternative explanation is that when a left-wing party moves to the center, it picks up a lot of voters at the center, but on average, this added support is roughly canceled out by the voters they lose on the wings, who either defect to another party or who decide not to turn out at the next election. So we couldn't make individual level inferences based on this aggregate level data. So it was very important to me and my co-author, Zeynep Sommer-Topçu, to try to determine, to the extent that this aggregate level non-relationship is correct, does this reflect a world in which voters don't react at the individual level, or where voters do react, but you gain some voters and lose other voters, and on average, it's about a wash? So what we decided to do in this next round of research was a pooled time series analysis of parties' left-right shifts versus shifts in survey respondents' perceptions of parties' positions. And the question we were trying to answer here is, when parties shift their positions, do voters even notice? You know, if they don't notice, we can be pretty sure they won't respond. And so if we get the answer that voters don't notice, then I would feel that we're some way towards figuring out what's really going on. So, what I did in research, once again, with Zeynep Sommer-Topçu, and also Lawrence Ezro, who some of you know, and he's also a former student of mine who's now at Essex University, was we conducted analyses where the independent variable was once again shifts in parties' left-right positions over time based on the codings from the Comparative Manifesto project. our key dependent variable was no longer the party's vote shares. What it was the mean placement of the party by survey respondents at the current national election versus the mean placement at the previous election. And so the logic here was very simple. If the CMP codings tell us that New Labour, that the Labour Party between 1992 and 1997 shifted dramatically towards the center of the space, do we see, if we look at the 1992 and 1997 British election studies, that on average respondents were placing Labour at more centrist locations in 1997 than they had in 1992. And so what we did was we used the comparative manifesto project data, and for the dependent variable, we used national election surveys from several different countries. I always forget the exact list. We had Germany, we had Britain, we had the Netherlands, we had Denmark, we had Norway, and there may have been one other Western European democracy. And in each country, we had about an average of maybe 8 or 9 election surveys. So we had, as I recall, 100 to 150 cases where we could see how voters' perceptions shifted over time. Well, what we found was, once again, surprising to me and displeasing. What we found was that when parties were coded as shifting their positions along the left-right scale based on the comparative manifesto project, there was not one iota of evidence that voters' perceptions of the parties systematically shifted in the same direction. Now, I found this shocking, and it's not what I wanted to find. You know, as I mentioned early on, a lot of my life is trying to understand parties' election strategies and their policy strategies. Well, if parties can say anything and voters don't even notice, you can throw most of my research of the last 20 years into the trash bin, because it's all about how parties should position themselves. So I hated this particular result. We did some other robustness tests that I'm happy to talk about, but if you're interested, but for right now, just to move ahead, I won't do that. So we wrote this up as a paper, which we titled, "Is Anybody Listening?" And our answer was, nobody is listening, and this paper is going to be forthcoming sometime later this year. So we sent this one out to a journal as well, American Journal of Political Science, in fact. And we got some positive comments, and we also got one really negative comment. And since it's fun to wallow in the details of despair, let's focus, shall we, on the negative comment, which once again is tattooed into my brain. We got 4 reviews. 2 of them were, this is good, this is important, da-da-da. One review, well, you're halfway there, but you need to do this to convince me. And the last review began, and again, I remember the words verbatim, "This paper should never have been written, and with luck, it will never be published. In fact, if it is published, it will be a great example of how not to do research." Yeah, that was fun, Jeff. That was fun when I got that. When I got this review, well, Lawrence had already been a professor, or whatever the equivalent is here in Britain, for a few years. He wasn't two-faced. My poor student, Zeynep Somertopku, was essentially in tears when we got this review, especially since I could tell it was written by this very famous political scientist who will remain nameless. Although I'll simply say he's British. But he will, aside from that, he will remain nameless. She was, "Oh my God, our work is terrible. Don't you feel absolutely awful about how terrible our research is?" I was able to show her some of my earlier reviews, which I've told you about, and let her realize that you can have a career despite getting these kinds of reviews. Incidentally, one comment again for the graduate students here. One thing you'll just get used to over time. When you get your first set of negative reviews, it will hurt like heck. There's no way for me to tell you anything to make it not hurt. Because when you get your first negative reviews, my reaction was, well, I'm getting these because I'm a bad researcher and I'm probably a bad person besides. You take them, it's almost impossible not to take these as reflections of your self-worth when you're getting your first review. You don't have anything else in the information bank except this 2 or 3 reviews saying that you're an absolute idiot. I can honestly say at this point, when I get the negative reviews, it's kind of annoying if it means, oh, now I have to revise the paper and send it to another journal. But I honestly couldn't care less about what it implies about me. At this point in my career, I've got hundreds of very positive reviews and hundreds of really, really negative reviews. When I get one more negative review, it just means the ratio is changed by 1. That's all. And so I kind of like that when I actually send in these papers with grad students, and almost everything I do these days is co-authored with a graduate student. Sometimes I kind of think it's a good thing when we get a nasty review, because I would like my graduate student, when she or he gets their first negative review, to have sort of someone to share the blame with. Oh, it's not that I'm an idiot, it's that Professor Adams is the idiot for having sent this out. And they don't feel so horrendous about themselves, and they realize what everyone here who's a professor can tell you, we get these nasty reviews all the time. It's just part of the game. Anyhow, so despite the really negative review, one other comment, which is kind of off topic, but you may find it sort of interesting. You know, one reason why these horrible reviews now don't bother me so much, even this one that said should never have been written, should never have been published, when the reviewer is too over-the-top nasty, reviewers tend to, the editors tend to ignore the review. Because they say, well, this is just so crazy that I don't trust this person's judgment. You know, in this case, when the editor sent back the reviews, the editor said, well, you need to satisfy this reviewer about this, and this reviewer now is skeptical. You need to have this reviewer say that this is publishable, but you can completely ignore this other review. Perhaps the reviewer was having a bad day. You know, you don't get killed with really nasty reviews often. You get killed with mediocre reviews. You get killed with the reviews that say, there's nothing wrong with this paper, but it's not very interesting. And I get those sometimes. You can't do anything about that. But if you get the really nasty ones, sometimes the reviewer shoots himself or herself in the foot, making those kinds of comments.
Just on that point about the interestingness of the paper, I mean, that's true, certainly in my experience, it's the kind of mediocre reviews that oftentimes